The hypocrisy of Voltaire and d'Alembert had triumphed over every obstacle. They had so perfectly succeeded in their abuse of all who dared oppose the encyclopedia, whom they represented as barbarians and enemies to literature. They had found such powerful support during the successive ministries of d'Argenson, Choiseul, and Malherbe, that all the opposition of the Grand Dauphin, of the clergy, and of the religious writers could not avail, and this impious digest was in future to be looked upon as a necessary work. It was to be found in every library, whether at home or abroad. It was always to be referred to. Thence, the simple mind in quest of science was to imbibe the poison of infidelity, and the sophister was to be furnished with arms against Christianity. The conspirators, though proud of their first invention, could not dissemble that there existed a set of men whose zeal, whose learning, whose weight and authority might one day counteract their undertaking. The church was defended by her bishops and all the lower clergy. There were, moreover, numerous orders of religious always ready to join the seculars for her defense in the cause of Christianity. But before we treat of the means employed for the destruction of these defenders of the faith, we must show the plan formed by Frederick, whence they resolved on the destruction of the Jesuits. As a first step toward dismantling the church and effecting the destruction of her bishops and of her different orders of priesthood. In the year 1743, Voltaire had been sent on secret service to the court of Prussia, and among his dispatches from Berlin we find the following written to the minister Amelot. In the last interview I had with His Prussian Majesty, I spoke to him of a pamphlet that appeared in Holland about 6 weeks back, in which the secularization of ecclesiastical principalities in favor of the Emperor and Queen of Hungary was proposed as the means of pacification for the empire. I told him that I could wish with all my heart to see it take place, that what was Caesar's was to be given to Caesar, and the whole business of the church was to supplicate God and the princes, that by his institution the Benedictine could have no claim to sovereignty, and that this decided opinion of mine had gained me many enemies among the clergy. He owned that the pamphlet had been printed by his orders. He hinted that he should not dislike to be one of those kings to whom the clergy would conscientiously make restitution. And that he should not be sorry to embellish Berlin with the goods of the church. This is most certainly his grand object, and he means to make peace only when he sees the possibility of accomplishing it. It rests with your prudence to profit of this his secret plan, which he confided to me alone. At this time the court of Louis XV began to be overrun with ministers who on religious matters thought like a Voltaire or a Frederick. They had no ecclesiastical states, no ecclesiastical electors to pillage, but the possessions of the numerous religious orders dispersed through France could satiate their rapacity, and they conceived that the plan of Frederick might be equally lucrative to France. The Marquis d'Argenson, Councillor of State and Minister of Foreign Affairs, was the great patron of Voltaire. It was he who, adopting all his ideas, formed a plan for the destruction of all religious orders in France. The progress of the plan was to be slow and successive, lest it should spread alarm. They were to begin with those orders that were least numerous. They were to render the entrance into the religious state more difficult, and the time of professions was to be delayed until that age when people are already engaged in some other state of life. The possessions of the suppressed were artfully to be adapted to some pious use or united to the episcopal revenues. Time was to do away with all difficulties, and the day was not far off when, as Lord Paramount, the sovereign was to put in his claim to all that belonged to the sees of the bishops. The whole was to be added to his domains. That the French ministry often changed, but that the plans of the cabinet never did, and that it always watched the favorable opportunity, was the remark of a shrewd and observing legate. The plan for the destruction of religious orders had been made by D'Argenson in the year 1745, though 40 years after it still lay on the chimney-piece of Maurepas, then Prime Minister. I owe this anecdote to a person of the name of Bevis, a learned Benedictine, and in such high repute with Maurepas that he often pressed him to leave his hood, promising him preferment as a secular. The Benedictine refused such offers, and it was not without surprise that he heard Maurepas tell him, when pressing him to accept his offer, that secularization would one day be his lot. He then gave him D'Argenson's plan, which had long been followed and would soon be accomplished. Avarice alone could not have suggested this plan, as the mendicant orders, as well as the more wealthy, were to be destroyed. It would have been folly to attempt its execution before the encyclopedian sophisters had prepared the way. It therefore lay dormant many years in the state offices at Versailles. In the meantime, the Voltairean ministry, fostering infidelity, pretended to strike, while they secretly supported the sophistical tribe. They forbade Voltaire to enter Paris, while, in amazement, he receives a scroll of the king confirming his pension, which had been suppressed 12 years before. He carries on his correspondence with the adepts, under the covers and under the very seals of the first secretaries and of the ministers themselves, who were perfectly conversant with all his impious plans. It was this very part of the anti-Christian conspiracy that Condorcet meant to describe when he says, often a government would reward the philosopher with one hand, whilst with the other it would pay his slanderer, would proscribe him while it was proud of the soil that had given him birth, punished him for his opinions, but would have blushed not to have partaken of them. This perfidious understanding between the ministers of His Most Christian Majesty and the anti-Christian conspirators hastened their progress, when the most impious and most despotic of ministers judged that the time was come for the decisive blow to be struck. This minister was the Duke of Choiseul. During the whole time of his power, he was the faithful adept and admirer of Voltaire, who says, Don't fear opposition from the Duke of Choiseul. I repeat it. I don't mislead you. He will be proud of serving you. Or to Marmontel, we have been a little alarmed by certain panics, but never was fright so unfounded. The Duke of Choiseul and Mad, the Pompadour, know the opinions of the uncle and of the niece. You may send anything without danger. In fine, he was so secure in the Duke's protection against the Sorbonne and the Church that he would exclaim, The Ministry of France, forever long live the Duc de Choiseul. The Ministry of France, forever long live the Duke of Choiseul. The Duc de Choiseul. This confidence of the premier chief was well placed in Choiseul, who had adopted and acted upon all the plans of D'Argenson. The ministry prognosticated a great source of riches to the state in the destruction of the religious, though many of them did not seek in that destruction of religion. They even thought some of them necessary, and the Jesuits were accepted. Unfortunately, these were the very men with whom Choiseul wished to begin, and his intention was already known by the following anecdote. Choiseul, one day conversing with 3 ambassadors, one of them said, "If I ever chance to be in power, I will certainly destroy all religious orders excepting the Jesuits, for they are at least useful to education." "As for my part," answered Choiseul, "I will destroy none but the Jesuits, for their education once destroyed, all the other religious orders will fall of themselves." And his policy was deep. There can be no doubt but that destroying the order in whose hands the majority of the colleges were at that time would be striking at the very root of that Christian education which prepared so many for the religious state. In spite, therefore, of the exception, Choiseul still sought to sway the council by his opinion. The Jesuits were tampered with, but in vain. So far from acceding to the destruction of the other orders, they were foremost in their defense. They pleaded the rights of the church. They supported them with all their weight in their writings and their discourses. This gave occasion to Choiseul to remonstrate with the council and to persuade them that if they wished to procure to the state the immense resources of the religious possessions, it was necessary to begin with the destruction of the Jesuits. This anecdote I only cite as having heard it among the Jesuits, but their subsequent expulsion strongly corroborates its veracity. Whether these religious deserved their fate or not is alien to my subject. I only wish to point out the hand that strikes, and the men who, as D'Alembert says, gave the orders for their destruction. Treating of the anti-Christian conspiracy, I have only to ascertain whether the destruction of the Jesuits was not conceived, urged, and premeditated by the sophistical conspirators as a means powerfully tending to the destruction of Christianity. Let us then examine what the body of men really was. Let us then examine what that body of men really was, and how necessarily odious they must have been to the conspirators from their general reputation. Let us, above all, hear the sophisters themselves. Let us see how much they interested themselves in their destruction. The Jesuits were a body of 20,000 men, spread through all Catholic countries, and particularly charged with the education of the youth. They did not, however, on that account, neglect the other duties of the ecclesiastic, but were bound by a particular vow to go as missionaries to any part of the globe if sent to preach the gospel. From their youth, brought up to the study of literature, they had produced numberless authors, but more particularly divines, who immediately combated any error that might spring up in the church. Latterly, they were chiefly engaged in France against the Jansenists and sophisters, and it was their zeal in the defense of the church that made the King of Prussia style them the lifeguards of the Pope. When 50 French prelates, cardinals, archbishops, or bishops assembled were consulted by Louis XV on the propriety of destroying the order, they expressly answered, "The Jesuits are of infinite service to us in our diocese, whether for preaching or the direction of the faithful, to revive, preserve, and propagate faith and piety by their missions, congregations, and spiritual retreats, which they make with our approbation and under our authority. For these reasons we think, sire, that to prohibit them from instructing would essentially injure our diocese, and that it would be difficult to replace them with equal advantage in the instruction of youth, and more particularly so in those provincial towns where there are no universities." Such, in general, was the idea entertained of them in all Catholic countries. It is necessary for the reader to be acquainted with it, that he may understand and of how much importance their destruction was to the sophisters. At the time, the Jansenists had the honor of it, and indeed they were very ardent in its promotion. But the Duke of Choiseul and the famous courtesan, La Marquise de Pompadour, who then held the destiny of France under the shadow and in the name of Louis XV, were not more partial to the Jansenists than to the Jesuits, both confidants of Voltaire. They were consequently initiated into all the mysteries of the sophisters. And Voltaire, as he says himself, would willingly have seen all the Jesuits at the bottom of the sea, each with a Jansenist hung to his neck. The Jansenists were nothing more than the hounds employed in the general hunt by Choiseul, the Marquise de Pompadour, and the sophisters. The ministers, spurred on by his impiety, the Marquise, wishing to revenge an insult, as she called it, received from Père Sassy, a Jesuit. This father had refused her the sacraments unless by quitting the court she would in some sort atone for the public scandal she had given by her cohabitation with Louis XV. But if we judge by Voltaire's letters, they neither of them needed much stimulation, as they both had always been great protectors of the sophisters, and the minister had always favored their intrigues as far as he could consistently with circumstances and politics. The following pages will show these intrigues, and we shall begin with D'Alembert, who writes in the most sanguine manner on their future victory over the Jesuits, and on the immense advantages to be derived to the conspiracy by their downfall. You are perpetually repeating, "Crush the wretch! For God's sake, let it fall headlong of itself." Do you know what Astruc says? It is not the Jansenists that are killing the Jesuits, but the encyclopedia. Yes, the encyclopedia, and that is not unlikely. This scoundrel Astruc is a second Pascal, and sometimes says very good things. I, for my part, see everything in the brightest colors. I foresee the Jansenists naturally dying off the next year after having strangled the Jesuits. This I foresee toleration established, the Protestants recalled, the priests married, confession abolished, and fanaticism, religion crushed, and all this without its being perceived. The express words of the conspirators show what part they had in the destruction of the Jesuits. They were indeed the true cause. We see what advantage they hoped to reap from it. They had kindled the hatred and procured the death warrant. The Jansenists were to serve the conspirators, but were themselves to fall when no more wanted. The Calvinists were to be recalled, but only to perish in their turn. To strike at the whole Christian religion was their aim, and impiety with its sophisters was to range uncontrolled throughout an infidel world.